Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our wellness series. It gives me great pleasure to host this panel discussion today. I think on a topic that's really important and necessary at this time so that we could be responsive to our young people. Today we have two brilliant women I have the pleasure of knowing and working with who'll be talking with me about talking with Black and Brown youth amid the racial injustice that we are witnessing, the rise that is happening, and how we position this movement to really be truly not only just an ally, but really a co-conspirator on systemic changes that need to occur, not only in our state, but across the country. I want to start by saying that for me and Metro New York, it's pretty much a no-brainer for us. Black Lives Matter. We need to elevate this conversation. We need to make sure that our programs are positioned and ready to have the important conversations that need to be had in community, but more importantly, that they are ready to take action. And so to that end, my organization and under my leadership, we are going to work really, really hard to listen to the Black leadership in our mentoring movement, to really have difficult discussions about the work that we do and how we elevate it so that it is truly work that is transformative for Black youth, Brown youth, for all the youth that we work with, but that we're consistent, right? And that we're true to our word. And so this will be one of many conversations we need to have. I've had many conversations with Dr. Ward and Chotsani about not only the subject, but also the work that has to be done. And we only have an hour. So we're going to start this conversation that will continue to happen. I'm committed to continuing the conversation, as I know that both of them, as my partners and leaders in this cause, will help me stay honest, stay focused, and keep having the conversation. So today we're going to focus this conversation about how to have these conversations moving forward. And what I would like for everyone to do, you are in listen only mode, is make sure that you put in your questions as we have these conversations. We'll try to do our best to get to as many of them at the end of the session as possible. But if we don't, we're doing mentoring take 2. So after this webinar, we actually continue the conversation, focus on the questions you submitted, and we'll send you the recording so that you can hear sort of the thinking around some of the questions that your colleagues who are on the line and yourself may have as we have this conversation. So I'm going to start with introducing our panelists who are true leaders across this state around diversity and equity and inclusion. And so I'll start with Chotsani, who is an MA Educational Leadership and Technology doctoral student and is the Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Adelphi University. She had joined Adelphi in 2014. And is also a mentoring program coordinator, which I think is one of the things I love about both of our panelists today. They are part of this movement, our mentoring movement. She's earned a bachelor's degree from Pennsylvania State University and a master's degree in educational leadership and technology at Adelphi. She's presently working on her doctorate, as I mentioned before, in educational leadership and diverse learning communities at Malloy College. She's worked in the education system, in community-based organizations most of her career, so she knows this space really, really well. Dr. Ward is a Ph.D. MSW MDiv, is the Associate Professor of Social Work at Niagara University and the Endowed Faculty Director for Bente Lee Ostapenko Center for Race, Equality, and Mission for the university. Dr. Ward designed and runs a program, REACH program, that just had an amazing second year, I believe, this year with young people. This program allows for high school juniors and seniors to earn college credits and connect with the people and resources that they need to become critical thinkers and outstanding leaders in the community. She's also the co-chair of Niagara University's most recent Identifying and Dismantling Racial Injustice Task Force. Dr. Ward has earned her doctorate in social work and sociology from Boston University. She is a macro-trained social worker. She has been the lead investigator, research associate, and research associate on a number of studies focusing on society's most vulnerable, underserved, and proven risk populations, including populations of foster care youth, recent parolees, child welfare workers, and healthcare providers. So I welcome the both of you and thank you for being with me. I think this is an important conversation. And so I, on a very personal note, just want to kick it off by asking all of you, or both of you, how are you doing? How are you doing when this is your life's work? You've been sounding the bell for as long as I know you, and I know long before I got to know you. And now sort of we have this watershed moment. And so I guess on a personal note, how are you doing? And what does this mean for your work as you think about it? And I'll toss it to Chotsani first, and then we'll move to Dr. Ward.
Yes. Thank you, Brenda. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Dr. Ward. And I appreciate the question. I think that we are all taking very long, deep breaths and considering all that is taking place, I'm doing fairly well. I feel that despite the immense challenges that we've had, I have some joy knowing that we are starting real dialogue that will help to move the needle. So, but before, my work as an emerging researcher and as a doctoral student and, someone who's been dedicated to this work, I really lead with the position of wife and mother to a family. And so for me, this work is deeply personal, and it makes me think doubly hard about some of the conversations that I have. So it's deeply personal. It's in my DNA. I am the daughter of a Southern family who marched in civil rights movement, right? And who were very clear about their position in the world very early on, and talking about the importance of education and how that is one thing that cannot be taken from you. And so before the work is that place that I really hold firm to in terms of my positionality and who I am. And so I appreciate the question. And when folks ask, how are you? That helps with doing well and really feeling a little bit better at the end of the day. So thank you for asking.
Thank you. Dr. Ward.
Brenda, I want to say thank you for inviting us to this conversation. And I'm really excited that so many people thought that this was a conversation that they needed to take part in today. That's really encouraging. I think when I think about, am I okay, right? I have to think about some of the resources that I have that are protecting me from some of the experiences that others may have at this point, right? And I'm okay because of those resources and because of the opportunities that I have acquired over the course of my lifetime, right? The interventions that have happened. So I am busy. Many people want to talk at this point. Many people want to show you some statements. Many people want to get some insights, right? Working and along with both of these crises, the civil unrest and civil rights #2, as I like to call it, as well as the pandemic, both of these issues require us to be embedded in the community, trying to make sure the right conversations are having about our people. So I'm okay, I'm busy, but it is energizing. That's what I take from it. I'm extremely energized.
I appreciate that, and thank you for being on. I guess for me, really quickly, as everything starts to happen, I really think to the fact that, especially throughout New York State being the epicenter of COVID-19, we have children who are experiencing, especially Black youth, are experiencing disproportionately the pain of a pandemic, right? And then to witness for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the death of a Black man before their eyes, where they can't run or hide because everybody's home watching. And it's on, a quick feed online and every platform that you can imagine. All the things that our young people are experiencing, and what is our role and our position in it, and are we ready to have these conversations, these real conversations that young people want to have. And so very quickly after I released my statement, I got bombarded with emails about how do we have this conversation with our mentees, with our Black families? How do I do it in a way that's thoughtful, meaningful, and impactful? And so I want to start there. I want to start with, why is it so difficult for people to have this conversation? And how do we have these conversations? So I'll start with Dr. Ward. Why is it so difficult for us to have this conversation? And then the second piece to my question is, it is no secret that in the mentoring movement, most of our mentors are white, and they are mentoring Black young boys and girls. And these conversations are going to come up. What do they do? What do they say?
So I'm going to read one quote for you. I have a couple of quotes from one of my favorite books, and I'm going to try and weave those in. So your question was, why is it so difficult for us to have these conversations? And so I'm reading from the James Cone's book, Said I Wasn't Gonna Tell Nobody, right? And he writes about liberation theology. I have a master's in divinity, although I'm not a pastor. I love having conversations about what does it mean to be faithful and to practice religion. But in his book, he says, it took many years of vomiting up all the filth I had been taught about myself and half believed before I was able to walk on this earth as though I had a right to be here, right? It's difficult to have these conversations because we've never had a truthful conversation. So we don't know where to begin, right? There are many concepts that we've constructed about what does it mean to be Black and brown, or what does it mean to be the white person in that relationship that was built on negativity, brutality, violence, distortion. So if it was built on something that isn't whole, it makes sense that we can't have conversations right now, right? Because right now we're asking people to tell the truth. But if you've never told the truth, then how can you have a conversation?
Right. Right.
So I think that's really, people talk about the emotional baggage, right? The triggering. And I'm one of those people who says that. But I think realistically, we have to identify and start telling the truth so that we can have more informed conversations about what really needs to happen.
Chotsani, why is it so hard?
I would echo that and say that historically there has been a power dynamic that people have to just recognize. And I think as a mentor, your role is to help guide and shape conversations that will lead to, mutually beneficial outcomes, right? And so the question that you started off this conversation with is just so powerful. How are you doing? And you may not always have the right words as a mentor who does not look like the student mentee, but it is okay to say that. I don't have all the words, but I am watching this endless news loop of things that are stirring my soul and make me uncomfortable. So how can I be the best mentor to you? But first acknowledging that you are aware and that it is not just another great weekend, right? you have to ask the question, and you have to ask yourself, how can I be of service to this young person who I have been connected to, this young person who I may not have otherwise had the opportunity to meet? You have such a powerful opportunity to have those, as Dr. Ward said, those real conversations that have just never taken place. You know, folks have danced around it for so many years that now that it's on everyone's radar, the lift becomes heavier. And so for me, that is the place to start. And then you begin to move into that place of healing and conversations about action and those listening, that active listening that's required. You know, all the tools that you equip your mentors with, this is something that they now have to actualize and lift it off the paper and apply it to this very relevant current conversation. But I think the idea that everything is just okay, it's it boggles my mind. Yes, because we had to be sheltered in place, and there's no network that you could turn to that didn't cover the realities of our new normal. Then we had the tragic murders that we witnessed. And so for me, acknowledging is the first step, and simply stating it for what it is, and being open about that.
And I just want to jump in here because I had a reminder lesson last week about how young people may be internalizing all of this that's going on. And I was talking with a dear friend who's given me permission to share this story, because I told her I need to share the story with anybody and everybody that I come in contact with. And she's a person of means. In fact, she's a physician. You know, her children have had the best resources. She has a young son, an 8-year-old son who is Black. And so he said to her, he generated a question for her. And the question that he had was, Mommy, is it better to die of COVID-19 than to be shot later when I'm older? I paused, right? It literally took my breath away, because at that moment, I said to myself, this child has formulated constructs related to death and is determining which way he ultimately will pass away. How do you help a child at this young age, 8 years old, have a conversation about death that's related to his color? Right? As a child of a physician, he's learning about the disease and whom it is impacting at greater numbers. And he is seeing things on television, right? Or, I mean, Buffalo is in the news right now, right? Regarding what happened in our city. The helicopters are flying all over. People are saying in Buffalo, and I'm not putting anybody down in another city, but they're talking about, man, it feels like we're in LA, right? With the helicopters all hovering around all the time. And so there's no escaping it. As Chotsani said, right there, it is present. And so we have to assume with our young people, they've already internalized these two global crises. It is our duty to make sure that we are creating opportunities for them to get it out.
Yeah.
Right. And within that is the reality that there's some work to be done before we engage in those conversations. So tell me, as a parent, as a mentor, white, non-Black person of color, what is it that we need to do to get ready for these conversations? Because I've seen a lot of stuff where people are infusing their political opinions. They're trying to deflect, and they're not showing up as their truth, authentic self per se, out of fear that they'll be called a racist or not understand or not have compassion. So what is the work that has to be done to get ready for this? Because my fear is if we haven't even had the truthful conversation, we're not going to be ready to know that an 8-year-old can really process and internalize this. So how do we get ready?
So I would say that there are several steps, but just going back to the powerful story that Dr. Ward shared in terms of the resources that you would have as a physician. Every space that you are in is a space to, I believe, address injustice, right? Classrooms are spaces for social justice conversations and race relations, and every space that you enter has to become a safe and brave environment for these conversations to take place. And the reason why I think that it's so challenging is because, again, we have not utilized those spaces in that way. And so, when we roll up our sleeves with community-based work and nonprofit work, we're already in that arena, that environment. And so I think we have to start to shift to think about all of those environments, all environments, as the opportunity to have these discussions. But in terms of an actualized thing that I think folks can do is to, you all have heard the term decolonizing your bookshelf, right? There's no reason at this stage in our age of technology, there's no reason, no excuse, no rationalization for not accessing resources that would help you to better understand the experience of people. There's no reason to not develop your own questions about what you are reading and reach out to your network. If your network is not diverse, it is upon you to do the work to think about and to reflect on how you can become better equipped to have conversations. Because a lot of my colleagues and folks in my community and my tribe are exhausted, but we still hold on to joy that we can be educators, but then we're doing the heavy work. And so for me, it's looking at resources and books and articles and listening is an action step. Getting involved in your local communities, asking the questions of your elected officials who can impact policy and make changes, so that you're lifting your thoughts off of the paper and seeing things actually move the needle towards policy that oftentimes is harmful for Black and Brown young people. And so for me, it's about utilizing what you have in front of you and then finding those resources that will best equip you and creating your own space. I think that there's your own way, if you will. I'll share something that Dr. Bettina Love shared on a session that she held a few days ago. She talked about the importance of staying in your lane. And what this referred to was using your strengths that you bring to the table as a researcher who is going to work with organizers, who is going to work with policymakers. Yes, so you don't have to do it all, but what you can do is strengthen what you bring to the table and add to the conversation. So as a researcher, how are you collaborating with all of the different constituents who can move things forward? And so I loved what she said in terms of staying in your lane. And she talks a lot about doing more than surviving. And so that's a part of all of the things that she's connecting for people to do, leading toward action.
I agree, right, that there is an aspect of informing yourself. And I want to answer this two ways, right? The what do I do? How do I begin this conversation? I think the reason why people are protesting is because there wasn't a sense of urgency about the deaths.
Yeah.
Okay. So they weren't protesting because there was another one. They were protesting because it was clear that people needed to be arrested for George Floyd's murder, and they were not being arrested. Okay. So if we have this idea that right now, the period of time that we're in, that there is a sense of urgency about what needs to be accomplished, then here's what I need all of our mentors to do. program leaders, mentors, executive directors, I need you to
Okay, we're ready.
call a staff meeting next week.
Yeah.
Right? I need you to call a staff meeting. And on that agenda is, where are we practicing racist behaviors? Now, I know that's a hard pill to swallow. I know it is, because everyone thinks that they're not. But guess what? If we have a system that was constructed by a particular philosophy, value system, norms and rules and all the policies that have one particular identity informing it, I guarantee you, you've got some racist practices somewhere. So next week, call that meeting. That is the urgency. On the individual side, this is what I need everyone to do. I need for you to start identifying, what are your values? What are your personal values? I need for you to ask the question, why do I believe that to be true? Because if you start doing the individual work, you might start to see that the reason why you believe what you believe is just simply because you've been told to believe it.
Right.
So the urgency is, as organizations, we need to change. On the individual level, it might take a little bit more time to deconstruct what is a part of our life in the current, understanding that it's all historical as well. And then the third thing, Chotsani brought up something really important. I know that everybody is going to Amazon and buying those titles that are pretty popular. Okay? I want to encourage people to go and get some of the historical texts. I want you to pick up Frederick Douglass, all 3 of his autobiographies. I need for you to pick them up. And the reason why I want you to pick them up and to begin to read them is you have to hear the horror that constructed our America. You have to hear it. And once you start to read those words, there is no way that you can walk away from those texts having the same thoughts. Your life should be changed as a result of reading those texts. So please, right? No more statements. I don't want any more statements posted, y'all. What I want is some action, complete action.
And may I add to that, the discomfort that you will feel after having read the urgency and the horror, I would love for people to just stay there for a moment and let that fuel their work, because it is uncomfortable, but you have to sit in it for a moment in order to understand the importance. And so, unfortunately, or fortunately, the rioting and the looting that we are seeing and that we have seen is the voice of people who felt unheard before. And so I think that when you connect the dots to that reading, when you see that some of the statements and the context and the experience that is shared, you will start to see the threading through of what we are starting, of what we're seeing. And so
Chotsani, I think you're breaking up. I'm sorry.
Thank you for going back before those popular trending titles.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, as I hear you both speak, is that there's a lot of layers to this, right? There is, to your point, Dr. Ward, what are we doing as an organization? I could not start having this conversation without asking myself, where am I in this space as a leader? What is it that I need to be saying? and what is it that I need to pursue in order to look at our system, right? Whether it's my own organization as I become the new CEO of Mentor New York, and into what is this movement really doing? We assume that because we're working with young Black and brown children, that we are part of the fiber of what is right, and don't look at maybe some of the missteps that we do as a movement in trying to do services to communities without talking to them or asking them what they really need. So really evaluating that piece. Having your staff come on board and understand where they live and lie, because how you produce marketing materials, how you talk about things, how you approach things, how you embrace people, how you hire people is all part of this systemic process, to your point, that we are all a part of and have to deconstruct in many ways. And then the final piece is one that we all know as youth development professionals, right? That as we're talking to young people, the hardest thing for adults to do is to really shut up and actively listen and let it all come to you. The same way that you're asking us to do that internal work of reading the text and sitting in the pain, I'm going to push our mentors and our professional staff to understand that when you have the conversation, you have to sit and listen and live with the pain of the young people that are talking to you, because it is real, right? It is a pandemic that most of our Black young boys and girls are experiencing loss, multiple loss, you know, on a continual level. And now to experience, to your point, really the social injustice that elevates the stress, the fear, the trauma that they are already experiencing in community, and navigating how not to let it impact their day in, day out sort of realities. And so I think the other piece is that in asking how you're doing, which is the first question, in doing the work, your young people are going to tell you things that will shake you to the core, and you have to listen and sit in it, not justify it, not redefine it for them, not say, well, that's wrong, or I see that differently, but really listen and sit in it and see how it is that you provide that guidance. So tell me a little bit about the forever need for people to reshape and reform an opinion or an emotion that you have around the racial injustice that you experience. How do we prevent doing that to our young people? Do you have any suggestions?
I think that you have to go in with a level of openness that you've never, and vulnerability that you have never, that you need to ramp up now, right? Because the tools that you give mentors through Mentor New York is to listen actively and to not interrupt. You're having folks apply those skills, but on a different level. So it's now at 1.0, 2.0, and that openness to not want to correct and present your own ideology and your own views, it will allow you to see their experience, you know, in their own individual experience. And so I think for me, that is where it would begin. And for mentors who are parents, you know, in their own home, in their own way, you can actually get involved, if you're not already, on your PTA board, right? And look at the library that is within your children's school. If the only time that you see literature by African Americans, people of color, is during the month of February, you have some questions to ask, because it is a collective work, it's an evolving work, and it's something that I believe must be normalized. Yes, and so because there's so many different layers to our history. You know, fortunately, I work in an institution where education is our thing, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is fully embraced in our units. And, you know, there's an openness there overwhelmingly. And so, you know, sometimes we have the people come to the conversation who are already a part of the choir. Yes, a lot of these conversations, you say, okay, well, we're having a conversation with the choir who's naturally coming. But then the question becomes, how do you get everyone else to the table who would not be inclined to do so on their own? if it is not something that is mandated or required. And so for me, there's so many different levels of ways to impact the change, but making those recommendations to your school board and to your PTA president, and speaking with your children's teachers in a way that leads to understanding and awareness about the importance of hearing other people's experiences is so critical. Looking at your syllabi, all of the things that we know will help our children to have a sense of belonging and that they can see themselves outside of their current circumstance, right? Or in addition to. And so I think that it's all connected in that way. You just have to folks have to find their place of comfort and discomfort and move toward that.
I think when we talk about how do we allow young people to have the space to express themselves, that means that we have to create intentional space for them to express themselves, right? So when you think about your mentoring programs, where is that space? Where is that time? Is it all about activities or connection time or events? I think we have to examine how we construct our interactions with our young people to see where we allow them to actually be emotionally expressive. So one of the phrases that I use, it's not mine, but I use the phrase emotional noise.
Mhm.
So I personally, I know that when I have emotional noise going on, I have to release. I release by either going for a walk, and believe it or not, my space, I love the cemetery, right? That is the space that I get to release my emotional noise. Maybe I'm trying to avoid not getting there anytime soon by getting rid of the emotional noise, right? Or back in the day when I lived in Massachusetts, going to the water used to be just so delightful for me. But ask young people, where's that space for them to let it go? Right? So I think we often think about that it has to be some kind of activity that we put together in order for them to do it. Maybe it's just as simple as for them as hey, you know what? Can I take a walk with you? And then in that walk, allow them to say, hey, what's going on? That's it. That's all you got to do. Right?
Mhm.
I think when we try to make it so complex and we design these strategies, these interventions, we may be missing the mark on what young people need in that moment. So I'm going to start with, where are the young people? What do they need? And how do we ask them what they need and create the time, the space for them to say what they need? And all you got to do is just listen.
Yeah. And suspend judgment, right? And suspend the comment you think is going to be so intelligent. Because I always say microaggressions come from people who are well intended and accidentally gave you a backhanded compliment or said the fact that actually triggers a lot of other pain in you. So
Right.
the fear of talking is sometimes that you want to say the right thing. And the right thing sometimes is to say nothing, is to let it sit there, is to understand it, is to say,
Right.
I hear you, I understand it. You have to be able to exercise that now more than ever, I think. And that is not a position that adults feel comfortable in with young people. We just don't, right? And we have to get, and hopefully the relationships you already have with these young people help you to build on that and to exercise it differently. But it is sort of like crucial time for when you have that, because if you do misstep, then the young person's less likely to keep opening up, right? Dr.
And,
Ward.
I was just gonna say, right there are a couple of things you learn in social work practice. You learn the right? So everybody who's on right now, practice the right? Tell me more. Right? Say it with me. Tell me more. Right?
Tell me more.
right?
Yeah.
You know, it's the how'd you feel,
Yeah.
right? And it's at the end, thank you for sharing. Thank you for trusting me. That's it.
Yeah.
If you can
Yeah.
use those few statements in your conversations with young people, you will have done them a world of good.
Yeah. Help me to better understand
Mm-hmm,
is one of those too.
mm-hmm,
Help me to better understand, because that's a statement that is inclusive of your acknowledgement that you desire to learn more.
right.
I love that.
Mm-hmm,
I love that too. I really do. I think this is about the power of getting mentally prepared to be present, completely present for the young people that you have relationships with. And I think to your point, Chotsani, the other piece, the other lane, if we're looking for lanes of activism or where do I make a difference, is where in your sphere of influence do you have the greatest power to elevate the voice, to be able to open opportunities that don't exist, that create the ability for people to become more conscious, more aware, and to see it, right? And then when they see it, to move to action, right? And so I'm going to ask you this last question before we open it up to questions, which of course, you know, I'm going to ask you the most complicated one, which is going to be impossible to unpack in a 3-minute answer. But I
No
hope that it's
pressure.
going to lead to our next conversation, hint, 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 for another panel um, around. I read this great article over the weekend, and Ben O'Keefe, who's the activist and former aide to Elizabeth Warren, sort of said that at this point, allyship is just a language. And what we all have to become is co-conspirators in doing the work. Um, and I thought, wow, that's really powerful. And that's, you know, when I started this, I remember, you know, writing our statement, and, you know, the subject was going to be their fight is our fight, right? I was definitely in action mode. And I think we decided to say, let's start with we're in solidarity, right?
mm-hmm,
And so I think for me, it is sort of that thought of, I said I was an ally, and now I've got to become a co-conspirator, right? And so, and do the work. And that means a lot of different things for a lot of different people. As you are part of this mentoring movement, how does the movement become a co-conspirator in making sure that we are part of the solution and part of the elevating of the voices to make sure that everyone's clear that Black Lives Matter? Dr. Ward, you can take that one.
we use the word in the center accomplice, right? Co-conspirator, accomplice. We don't use the
Mhm,
word ally. So for all my
mhm,
friends on the webinar, we're going to drop the word ally. We're no longer going to use that. We also use another word, cultural proficiency. That's the word we use. So not
mhm,
cultural competence. Because when you talk about cultural proficiency, that means that you actually your goal is to bring up the voices of those who are typically excluded from the conversation. And you're not representing their voice, but they are representing their own voice, right? So we're going to become co-conspirators or accomplices, and we're going to practice cultural proficiency. That's how we're going to begin this work. But I think the work actually requires us to look at all the various systems that we as mentor programs interact with. So we certainly can do the work in our little sphere, right? We can have that staff meeting next week, which we ask the question, where are our racist practices, right? But what I think we also need to do is we need to see what kind of relationships we have with other systems. So does your mentoring program work with a school system?
Mhm.
Does your mentoring program work with the criminal justice system? What does your mentor program work with? Because you need to press on them to do some work, right? And that may be difficult and challenging because it puts you in a position in which you might have to risk something.
Mm-hmm.
Brown and Black people are risking something every day. So if we're going to be true conspirators, we have to accept the reality that risk is now a part of our work. So the systems that our young people move back and forth in, we need to make sure that those systems support their whole being. And if they're not supporting their whole being, then we have work to do. So I think when we talk about the co-conspirator, we have to be clear that it requires you to say, at all costs, I'm in it. Not I'm in it for a little bit, but at all costs.
Right. And this is definitely a marathon and not a sprint, Chotsani.
That's right. It is that. And just to pick up on the piece about being whole and a piece about wellness, when you call that staff meeting, don't be afraid to call in people who are experts in this work, because once people start unpacking this, it can cause so many triggers and things for people to think about and to process on their way home. You know, hopefully you're inspiring people to have different kinds of conversations at their kitchen table. I really, truly believe in my heart, when you have conversations that you are pushing up against at your own kitchen table, that is often the hardest conversation to have, not in a setting of academia or in a setting of, you know, you're sitting with colleagues who are wanting to understand and wanting to learn. It's going back to, as Dr. Ward said, what you know and what you've been taught over years, kind of flipping that switch to what you knew and what you've become accustomed to. So challenging your family members is a cost. Are you going to, at that next family gathering, give a chin check, a gentle chin check to that person who is always talking talk that you know is not okay? And you know it when you hear it. So are you going to challenge it? What are you willing to lose is the question. And in the workplace, are you willing to risk your livelihood? You know, I think that I am in a very fortunate position to have these conversations real and very authentically, but I recognize that that's not the place that everybody is in. Yes, because when you talk about things that are not popular, especially before this moment in history, before this movement in history, you can easily risk your livelihood because it is not popular, and it has not been popular before now to have these real difficult conversations. So for me is, you know, that question that I leave people with: what kind of questions are you, along with those systems, what are you asking people to do? And also just, and I love, Dr. Ward, what you say about clarifying that term of allyship. What space are you taking, you know, as a co-conspirator? Is your job to step in front of or to walk alongside and to listen? You know, you can't take the voice from people who typically have not been heard. And so I know those are a lot of layers, but this work is just that there's so many different things, and you have to start peeling back things very slowly. So I encourage you to call in the experts and folks that you know can handle those difficult conversations and who can actually be an outside resource for you. Because when you unpack this, you still have a board meeting to go to. You still have a class to teach.
That's right. That's right. And I also think that we can't lean on our Black colleagues to be the voice, right? They've experienced and seen things within the system and the culture that you have, right, in many instances, and have had to be careful to not risk their livelihood, to not be seen a certain way. And so being able to give the opportunity for articulation to happen, but that it's not the lone voice in the room is a real important part of when you go into a staff meeting where you're the only person of color, right? And that's a really important part of this too, because that happens a lot in our mentoring programs and in our systems, and we have to be aware of that. So I am going to open it up because I know that there are questions. I believe there are questions. And I think that Jessica can hop on and help us figure out what are the questions that are there.
Hi, yes, there are definitely a lot of questions. The first one, someone asked, what advice can you give to white folks that do not think they have something to contribute to the conversation? What should be their focus?
So
You
I
want
was
to take
thinking
that
about,
to
yeah, so I was thinking about this. A metaphor was coming to my head this morning, right? And because I think people are struggling with this piece around it, can I participate in this conversation, right? And I said to myself, so when we all go out on the water, right, and when we're in a boat, we don't want a boat that has a hole in it, do we? Right? We don't want that. All of us want the boat
Right.
that's gonna float, right?
That's right.
When
That would be helpful if you don't know how to swim too.
see, there's some equity in that conversation right there. Why don't you know how to swim? So,
Yes.
but if we all want to float, right? If we all want to have a very nice time on that water, that means that all of us have to get into a boat that is not going to sink. This conversation about brown and black equity is about all of us, right?
That's right.
We don't want a society where people die because they don't have grocery stores in their community, right? Our health insurance go up, right? We don't want kids who don't graduate from high school because that means that we can't get people who can pay higher taxes, right? Like it's all intertwined. It is all intertwined. So if we think about it that as a Caucasian person, you know what, it's my responsibility to have these conversations because if I have this conversation, that means I am improving the situation for everyone.
I agree. And there's enough white people in this stratosphere who have gotten very deep and have become very rooted in the social justice work. And some of them might be your friend. Find them, talk to them how they move in those spaces and talk. Because I think to Chotsani's point, there's no excuse anymore not to find the resources you need to have those conversations to develop this skill. Because partially this is about developing a skill, getting comfortable so you can be uncomfortable in those situations, right?
But can I just jump in here one second on that about the white friend? Because one of the things that's written about is the white moderate, right? So we all believe that, you know, the friends who don't look like us, you know, have our back. But I almost feel like we need to take a quiz and we need to ask the question, do you really believe in this work, right?
Right.
Are you embedded in the community, right? Not are you serving on a board in the community, but are you embedded in the community, right? Like we have to ask questions that really establish their authenticity in this work, because the white moderate
This is true.
is the problem.
Right. It has to be someone you know. Absolutely. You have to ask the questions and know that it is somebody embedded in the work. Absolutely.
I love that.
Go ahead, Jessica. Next question.
One more, yeah. Someone had said, I think if I called a meeting of all my white staff of social workers and community workers, that they would say we don't have any racist practices. I don't think as a group they would be willing to admit or able to recognize their racist practices. What examples could I give to start the conversation?
I think that that is part of your answer. When you have people who are saying, it's not me, that is the quiz. Yes? How can you say no to a conversation that requires daily work and inquiry? Yes? And so for me, that's a red flag. If people are saying, no, I am doing this and I don't need any more tools. For me, this is a lifelong, you ought to want to be a lifelong learner, and that includes all things, yes? And so for me, the other way to offer this is a conversation about wellness and health. If you want to have a well, if you want to be well and whole, these are conversations that are required. And so there's no other way for me to add to that other than the experts that you bring in will have those tools. And so they should have evidence-based practices about what it is that they're sharing with your community. They should be able to help people to unpack, process, digest, and then come back to it again. And it not just be, a momentary conversation, but one that is threaded through all of the units within that respective institution.
And I'm a social scientist, right, who loves data, just loves it. And so I actually ask you to pull reports at your agency. I guarantee you there's disproportionality in your data. There's disproportionality in every system when we start to dissect the numbers by who is brown and by who is Black. So start with that. Start in your agency by putting together how many Black males, how many Black females, Latinas, right? Just break it down regarding what your outcome is for your organization. And see what the numbers tell you. We're living in the state where our governor says, let's look at the facts, right? Governor Cuomo loves that statement. Nothing but the facts. So I think if we start there, that's a great conversation for your social workers. Let's talk about, why do we think that these numbers exist the way that they do? And let's hear from them what comes out of what the data says.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's very true. And I also think the other thing to evaluate is every program can look at participation rates or engagement rates. And I think in the nonprofit sector overall, my experience in my last 20 years is we're one of the few sectors that when families or communities don't engage, there's always something wrong with them and not us, right, as the organization. If I had a restaurant and no one came to eat, you can blame it on the whole town for not supporting you, but you'd be out of business, right? And so at some point you would have to figure out why no one wants to eat there. And so from a service organization, a business, when you look at why aren't all the Black and brown families coming to our mixers? Why isn't there more parent engagement? Why is there the fact that we can't recruit more mentors of color? We have to stop making excuses about why other people aren't engaging with us and take some internal look as to what it is that we're doing that's not providing the attraction, the service, the need, the urgency for those communities to engage with us. And I think that that's another big piece. So I love when people tell me we don't have problems in that area, but then you list all the reasons why communities can engage with you. And it's always about them and never an evaluation about us. And I think as a sector, as a movement, as an organization, we have to start evaluating us and stop justifying that what we do is so right because we're doing it for the greater good, that there must be something wrong with the community.
That's right.
So I want to thank Dr. Ward and Chotsani so much for joining us. This is only the tip of the iceberg of this conversation. I could have gone in many different directions, but we only had an hour. We are going to do mentoring takes 2 right after this session to continue to answer the questions that everybody submitted so that we are honest brokers and are able to engage with the community that's been watching for this last hour. So I truly appreciate you've joined us. You have a barcode in front of you. Please take your phone, put it in front of the barcode, and magically the survey appears. Give us feedback. Let us know what else you want to be talking about so that we can start elevating these conversations. For us, this is only the beginning of the work that we need to do as a movement to really be thoughtful about how to do this work at scale and in a way that's meaningful across all the lives that we impact, but most especially in the lives of the Black and Brown youth that we serve. So I thank everybody for coming out and taking the time to be with us. Thank you, Dr. Ward, Chotsani, and Jessica.